Japan stands among the top supporters of Ukraine today. It provides major financial and humanitarian aid and backs Ukraine at the political level globally. These countries lie thousands of miles apart, so what brings them together? And has this difficult time of war brought the Japanese and Ukrainian people closer, helping them discover more about each other? You're listening to the Explain Ukraine podcast. Explain Ukraine is a podcast by UkraineWorld, a multilingual media about Ukraine. This episode is part of a joint series, Ukraine's Global Partnerships, produced by UkraineWorld and the Foreign Policy Council Ukrainian Prism. In this episode, UkraineWorld's Deputy Chief Editor Anastasiia Herasymchuk spoke with Tomonori Yoshizaki from Tokyo University of Foreign Studies and Anastasia Polishchuk from Foreign Policy Council Ukrainian Prism and Waseda University. UkraineWorld is brought to you by Internews Ukraine, one of Ukraine's largest media NGOs. My name is Volodymyr Yermolenko. I'm a chief editor of UkraineWorld. Before we start, let me remind you that you can support our work at patreon.com/UkraineWorld. You can also support our volunteer trips to the war zones at PayPal, ukraine.resisting@gmail.com. You can find these links in the description of this episode. This podcast series was created with the support of the International Renaissance Foundation. So let's start.
Mr. Yoshizaki, Anastasia, welcome and thank you for joining. At the time of Russia's full-scale invasion, Japan became one of Ukraine's most vocal supporters, providing substantial financial aid, humanitarian aid, imposing a number of sanctions on Russia, and showing support even at the level of society. This sense of closeness may not have been obvious to many, and the general public in both countries likely knew little about each other. Then, when the full-scale invasion began, Japan offered its full support to Ukraine. And in March 2023, the two countries signed a statement on a special global partnership during the Japanese Prime Minister's visit to Kiev. So, can we say that the war actually catalyzed Ukraine-Japan relations? Or maybe this boost of relations happened back in 2014? And what exactly does this special global partnership mean? Let me start with you, Mr. Yoshizaki.
Okay, thank you very much for invitations, and I'm so happy to speak for you. I used to work for the Ministry of Foreign and the Defense in Japan for 30 years. Now I'm just retired, and I'm a university professor. So let me start with the background, historical background. You mentioned about 2014, and it was a wake-up call for Japan to shifting to the more support to Ukraine. To be frank, before 2014, we were seeking for a possibility of having a bilateral deal and agreement with Mr. Putin, and especially with the Northern Territory issues, which was a kind of left out issues for Japan. So we were hoping to be optimistic and also finding a way to find a territorial kind of solution back in 2014, before 14. But that was the wake-up call that we were shifting from kind of the very kindly and kind of soft approaches to more realistic. Then what happened in 2022, February 24, is a very clear kind of change of the policy in many ways. Number one is diplomatically, more sanctions on Russia, and we were happy to deal with the other like-minded countries. A keyword is like-minded countries. And before that, we talked about the strategic partnership, including China and the Russia. But now, like-minded, meaning value-based approach. And those who are in the financial supports, that would be part of it. And IP4, Indo-Pacific 4, agreed among NATO members, was and is Japan and South Korea and Australia, New Zealand. these are like-minded. And the thing is, along with these four IP4, Ukraine joined. Then clearly stated that the security sector reform from Ukraine. So this is not only the Japan's financial problem or humanitarian support, but also a more security tilted the foreground. And Japan will be spending more kind of GDP 2% for the defense. So let me wrap up. So diplomatically, we are with you, and the information shared. Militarily, what used to be Japan was very pacifist. Now we were going to be more realistic. Then economically, there are many economic sanctions maintained and stepped up, and even with the possible kind of oversight about the post-conflict Ukraine situation. That would be my first take. Thank you.
Anastasia, what is the Ukrainian perspective on this special global partnership?
Well, unfortunately, Ukrainian foreign policy domain is quite known for having many strategic partnerships without necessarily committing to them or having the other side to commit. And fortunately, this time I think it's more meaningful than just many others. Ukraine is interested, and we will talk about Ukraine's interest later, but Ukraine is interested in having the most economically and socially developed countries on its side, and Japan is one of them. Meanwhile, let me just slightly disagree about the dynamics of the relationships. From the defense perspective and defense cooperation, of course, 2014 and 2022 are kind of watersheds, as Yoshizaki-sensei mentioned. But if we look from the Ukrainian policy perspective, the year of 2019-2020, when Ukraine started looking at a few countries like United States, Turkey, Japan as strategic partners, that year was crucial in changing the foreign policy perception of Ukraine in Japan, in my opinion. Our ambassador and our embassy started having Twitter, having more output, and basically this global partnership, which came during the wartime, it can be translated into something that is communicated not only to the political elites, but also to the people, and can be sensed and viewed by many. I think that is an important part, and I think a happy point in all of this, it wasn't Japan or our partner who necessarily initiated this. We were, for once, taking the initiative, and that's, I think, an awesome point to this.
Mr. Yoshizaki, you mentioned like-minded countries or countries that are united by certain values. And here comes the question, like general, at this conceptual level, why does Japan support Ukraine? And moving forward to the more practical level, what kind of assistance is being provided by Japan to Ukraine?
First and foremost, Japan regards that Russian clear the invasion to Ukraine is a clear challenge for status quo. Status quo has been changed by armed forces. And although Mr. Putin put it special military operations, but apparently it was against international norms and values. And this is a kind of value issues, but in the same category, the deterrence and defense matters, meaning that the general deterrence in Europe was destroyed by Russia. And deterrence is very important for members of the alliances. And Ukraine is not a member of NATO or the alliance network that by US, but Ukraine resilience, keyword maybe resilience, matters a lot about the situation. So why Japan support the Ukraine in a very clear way? The first one foremost the deterrence and defense global situations will be the primary concerns, not only in European theater, but also other theater, including Indo-Pacific. We say Indian Ocean and Asian Pacific connectivity. Keyword is connectivity. That means deterrence in general matters a lot about the managing conflict peacefully. So that's the reason why Japan care the Ukraine and also connectivity. And that policy implication is the last point. Okay, we say Taiwan issues, and China may have a greater, the possibility and hope for having a unification of Taiwan without provoking any intervention by other countries like the United States. So what we want is not have a power vacuum globally, and we should have a step up our effort. So let me conclude that the resilience of the Ukraine will be a priority. That's the reason why we provide so-called security guarantee. I think that is the first time we mentioned this one. And so in that sense, global security assurances and network is the primary concern. That's critical.
And we've talked about the kinds of assistance. What exactly is Japan doing for Ukraine? What kind of financial or humanitarian support is provided? And what is the concept laying behind this kind of assistance?
We provide about uh, it depends on the exchange rate, but the financial assistance about the 900 billion Japanese yen, and so it is a huge money, and one third of that one, that is the 300 billion Japanese yen, is for humanitarian. So meaning that financial assistance is a key, and humanitarian is very important. And we are ranked about six among the global partners. And as to the military, it is not very popular because it is beyond our horizon. So what we want is a financial kind of the sanction and support plus the humanitarian one. But the thing is, we have a step up in effort, and we were invited to the NATO the summit meeting every year. And this year, the July in Washington, D.C., celebrating the NATO, the 75 years anniversary in Washington, D.C. And we were in line with the South Korea and New Zealand, Australia, and the Ukraine, meaning that these are lined up for the stability across the globe, including European theater and Indo-Pacific. I think this is the first time to have a clear strategic connectivity in these two theaters.
And when we talk about the assistance and support during the difficult times as the full-scale invasion or the war in general, we shouldn't forget that any kind of bilateral relations mean that the countries have certain interests in each other, and any kind of cooperation have on this basis these certain interests. So let's shift further to this practical dimension and try to figure out why Ukraine is interested in cooperation with Japan and vice versa. What makes Ukraine appealing to Japan? Anastasia, let's begin with the Ukrainian perspective.
Well, probably very obvious and apparent reason, but in the wartime, Ukraine needs partners and allies. I mean, like-minded countries, as Yoshizaki sensei said, or somebody who's on your side. And Japan is a valuable partner with great experience and support initiatives. In the peaceful time, more so. Once again, Japan is a huge economic and soft power, and developing relations with one of the key players in the trade, economic, and cultural arena is crucial. In the wartime, it becomes important as well because economic reconstructions and economic survival for Ukraine matters probably as much, not nearly as much, but probably takes the second place among the priorities that Ukrainians face right now. Another point is that, for Japan, probably we can talk about Japanese perspective later. Also, Ukraine is interested in diplomatic representation across the world, and Japan has a crucial position for this. Japan is known reputationally to be a great mediator, a representative of the West, of the developed economies, with almost non-colonial reputation, or reputation for being too pushy and imposing its own rules. Hence, Japan has a good connection with what's called Global South, a bunch of variety of countries who are marked usually as developing economies. While Japan cannot turn that around and make everybody join the Ukrainian side, Japan does a lot diplomatically for Central Asia, Africa, Southeast Asia, to support Ukraine and to cooperate. And one more thing, of course, is that Ukraine needs everybody who's against revisionism and who's for the commitment to international law. Cultural and societal impact as well. Ukraine and Japan are huge markets, not only economically, but also culturally. And, they have a huge social potential for connection. They are interested in the niches that are mutually beneficial, like IT, agriculture, artificial intelligence, some very cutting-edge biological and physics-related fields. So cooperation in that field just corresponds to what Ukraine is perceiving for its defense, survival, and prosperity, and the same goes for Japan, in my opinion.
Let me start with my personal positions. I'm teaching at the university, and we have Ukrainian students in our class, and I invite her to speak for the class in Tokyo, and all the students in the class, the 20 or 50 or more, are so impressed about the clarity of the need for help. That is, the situations was the kicked off by Mr. Putin's aggressive and very offensive activities. So it is our responsibility to stop that aggressions. And as to the Japanese perspective, back in 1930s and 40s, Japan was a revisionist country, and we challenged China and also Korea, and we were a revisionist country and having a puppet state and continents. But after the war, we have the so-called occupation period and having the very new, totally different culture that conflict must be handled peacefully. So in this sense, the education in Japan is lots of peaceful, very peaceful, and looking to the Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and also those who are affected by nuclear bombardment in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. We were happy to see that the Nobel Peace Prize laureate and there's those who were damaged and attacked by American the bombardment. But please, let me underline that Japan was bombarded by U.S. in 1945 in Tokyo, and Hiroshima, Nagasaki all destroyed in 1945. But 5 years later or 60 years later, we became allied to the United States, meaning that, used to be we were enemies, but we had new cooperations and alliances. Then Cold War became the reality, and the American military in our region became a stabilizer and a deterrence and defense. So we had the deep interest and trust about the American commitment. Of course, in the Far East, from Ukraine, okay, Korean War and Vietnam War. And these are lots of the crises in our region. And the US activity was not very successful in these both cases. But there is no nuclear war after Hiroshima and Nagasaki. That's a good lesson to learn. So nuclear restraint and the no nuclear tactical nuclear weapons have been used after the Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So we must send a right signal that we are united and we are against it. And also the conflicts must be handled by peaceful, the peace-loving, the actors and those who are responsible for protect. So we endorse human security and responsibility to protect, meaning that we are lined up with a like-minded country like nature and European Union, and definitely the changing status quo by force cannot be tolerated at any cost. Let me conclude. That's the reason why the Japanese public, government, society are very supportive to the Ukraine, the government and people. And we learned that it was very hard time for everybody, but we will maintain sustainable assistance for the effort in Ukraine right now and so-called the post-conflict resolution. I think that will be the key. Thank you.
You've already briefly mentioned this support on the level of societies and the level of support within the societies and the necessity to understand each other. So, what is just as important as the political dimension is the people-to-people connection. So, can we say that at this stage, Ukrainians and Japanese are getting to know each other better? And what is the mutual perceptions of both nations in respective countries? So, what do Japanese people think about Ukraine and Ukrainians, and vice versa? What is the perception of Ukraine and of Japan and Japanese in Ukraine? And let's start with the Ukrainian perspective.
Well, when we talk about the social level, it is hard to speak about the perception of Japan in Ukraine statistically because, to my knowledge, we do not have a very consistent polling on this topic yet. As overall, we have many cultural festivals, and technically, in comparison with other what's called East Asia countries, Japan is perceived very favorably. That being said, I'm not sure that I can say that Ukraine-Japan relations at the societal level are developed to the extent that we can say that it's satisfactory. I would say it's much better than it was. My point is that before a certain time, it was very sporadic, very individual, and there was no systematic approach towards those. While in the past, in a few years before the war, with Ukrainian Institute trying to take an initiative and have a Japan-oriented foreign policy, cultural policy, and engage with the society. Well, that did happen and was an effort on the Ukrainian side. It did continue, but before that, there was not much happening. And so basically, starting from 2019, we have been developing those ties. You have a few thousands of evacuees in Japan, which plays to, well, making human connections, but please account for the fact that most of them reside in big Tokyo area or Kanto area around Tokyo, which means that perhaps if it's not a big city like Tokyo, Osaka, or perhaps some other big cities like Nagoya or Fukuoka, Japanese people may not have very much access to some, well, direct knowledge about Ukraine. Our embassy does as much as they can, but our resources, especially human resources, and perhaps financial, but human are most important, they're limited, right? So we do as much as we can, but of course we would like to do more, and for that we need people and finances, and I guess that's on Ukraine. We need to figure that out. Let me also mention one positive thing about societal factor. Um, this is my observation, but the amount of university exchanges between students increased. Of course, we cannot receive Japanese students in Ukraine due to the, well, war situation. Yet there are many more Ukrainian students who are not necessarily, well, full students, exchange students, as Yoshizaki Sensei mentioned about his Ukrainian student, or some other form, non-regular research students in Japanese universities, and they are quite active, performing with different lectures and activities. Our diaspora here with non-profit organizations like Krayani intensified their activities and holding different events, opening Ukrainian cuisine restaurants, cafes. But of course, it's just the beginning and much more needs to be done. But of course, the perception initially was favorable, has stayed favorable, and I think it will stay favorable, in my opinion. Ukraine perceives Japan because of its cultural impact and probably our perception and what we see on our screens in a very positive light. And we try to share that feeling towards Ukraine that we have towards Japan among Japanese people institutionally and, well, individually. Thank you.
Mr. Yoshizaki, what about the Japanese perspective?
We put it in 3 layers. Number one is a strategic level, like a G7 Hiroshima summit in 2023, and it was very impressive that President Zelensky came along with South Korea, India, Australia, meaning that we have a global partners and India, and also try to have a global South perspectives. So G7 maybe global North kind of tilt, but we try to bridge the gap between the so-called South, and meaning that offshore development assistance in Asia and Africa and Middle East should not be abandoned, should not be neglected. So this is a kind of global one, and another one maybe that strategic communication. The President Zelensky is a quite unique figure, providing messages and also a impression worldwide, meaning that this is an agenda setting, and we have the huge interest, like a plan for victory, and his the idea or the plan for victory may have some kind of challenges for rather defensive the perception and also assistance to the Ukraine, meaning that the escalation is most critical and we have to stop that. But without having an offensive capability, Russian kind of reaction, Russian the activity may not be changed. So this is a dilemma, and we say the dilemma in Ukraine and Taiwan issues. So strategically, we have a concerns and interest about the deterrence defense. And as to the national level, Japanese national level, well, I visited European capital many times, and last month I was in Paris and Brussels and Hamburg, some others, and we saw a lot of the Ukraine flag. And in Brussels, we see the European Union taking the lead of the European support for Ukraine, the resilience. Well, in Tokyo, we see some the fact of Ukraine at the national level in Tokyo, but it's quite limited, meaning that as to the national level, well, we need to do something more, and this is very important. Actually, the embassy in the Tokyo is very active, and I had a talk with the ambassador against the attaché many times, and these are very impressive. But still, as to the last one is local or people to people level. But to be frank, we don't have the so-called Ukraine community in Turkey. We have a Ukraine student and those who Japanese students who are into Ukraine culture and also languages, and but still the number itself is quite limited and small. So my message to my student and other the seminar member is that okay, Ukraine is the front line of the theater, just like Japan is. And in case of Far East, we have Russia and North Korea and China. So these are kind of hotline. So don't forget about the two theaters. These are, let me repeat, connected, like it or not. And upcoming American presidential election will have a huge impact about the level of commitment of the US and others. So we will see something may happen or we can maintain that level of high support to Ukraine.
Well, I hope that our today's conversation answered the questions about the nature of Ukraine-Japan relations and shed a light on what might be done to push them forward, to intensify it and make it more fruitful for both sides. Anastasia, Mr. Yoshizaki, thank you so much again for joining and thank you for your valuable insights.
Yeah, happy to be here.
Thank you very much.
This was a podcast Explain Ukraine by UkraineWorld, a multilingual media about Ukraine. This episode is part of a joint series Ukraine's Global Partnerships, produced by UkraineWorld and the Foreign Policy Council Ukrainian Prism. You can support our work at patreon.com/UkraineWorld. You can also support our volunteer trips to the front lines at PayPal, ukraine.resisting@gmail.com. You can find these links in the description of this episode. This podcast series was created with the support of International Renaissance Foundation. Thank you for listening, stay with us and stand with Ukraine.